Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech Talks, our virtual speaker series focused on technology ethics. My name is Elizabeth Ranieris, and I'm the founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. Along with my colleague, Kirsten Martin, director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, we're very happy to welcome you to the second installation of Tech Talks. This semester, we are focused on the theme of technology and power. The speed and breadth of technological advancement and proliferation are causing seismic shifts, often replicating historical and systematic racism, discrimination, and inequalities across every aspect of modern life, including work, education, healthcare, financial services, criminal justice, and more. Individuals and organizations with the power and resources to develop and deploy new technologies generate massive financial, social, and political capital, while marginalized members of society are often excluded from their benefits or else made to bear the brunt of invasive, destructive, and harmful applications. This fall, we are joined by leading experts, including academics, practitioners, and activists, to explore questions such as who reaps the benefits of new technologies and who suffers the harms or consequences. How is technology reshaping or reinforcing existing power dynamics in society, including with respect to gender and race? Can technology distribute power more equitably, and if so, how? And today is no exception, as we welcome two renowned experts to discuss the opportunities and risks presented by emerging digital identity systems and technologies, including their civil and human rights impacts on both individuals and communities. First up, we have Nanjala Nyabola, a writer and researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya, whose work focuses on the intersection of technology, media, and society. Nanjala has held positions with the Overseas Development Institute and the Oxford Internet Institute, and has led numerous projects on human rights and digital rights around the world. She's a fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Digital Forensic Lab at the Atlantic Council, the Center for International Cooperation at NYU, and the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab, among many other affiliations. Nanjala holds a BA in African Studies and Political Science from the University of Birmingham, an MSc in African Studies and an MSc in Forced Migration from the University of Oxford, and a JD from Harvard Law School. She's published widely in academic journals such as African Security Review and the Women's Studies Quarterly, and has authored articles for The Nation, Al Jazeera, the Boston Review, and others. She's also the author of Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, and also Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move. Alongside Nanjala today, we welcome Yussuf Bashir. Yussuf is the executive director of the Haki Sheria initiative, an NGO based in northern Kenya, where he is responsible for the overall leadership of the organization and specifically oversees their public interest litigation docket. Yussuf is also an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and has previously worked with various local and international NGOs. He was the lead counsel in the high-profile case related to the digitalization of Kenya's National Identity Register and the National Identity Number, some of you may have heard of, known as the Huduma Namba, and is also currently advocating on behalf of so-called double registration victims whose biometric data in the UNHCR's refugee database has effectively rendered them stateless. Yussuf has a master's degree in law from Queen Mary University of London and is a recipient of a prestigious Chevening Scholarship and has received numerous other awards for his digital identity-related advocacy. Well-credentialed guests today. Nanjala and Yussuf, thank you so much for being here to discuss identity and power. So I'll lead us in the discussion for about 30 minutes, after which we'll turn to questions from our attendees. For those who are in the Zoom, you can submit questions through the link in the chat, and for those watching in the live stream, you can submit questions through the link in the comments. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So since we tend to have a general audience for our tech talks, I'd like to start with a local case study, namely the digital identity and landscape in Kenya, since you're both intimately familiar with it. Yussuf, for those who are unfamiliar with Kenya's national ID system, could you please give us a brief overview of the key components at a high level, for example, the National Integrated Management System, or NIMS, and the Huduma Namba, and why they were introduced?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. The National Integrated Identity Management System is a digital infrastructure project that was introduced by the Kenyan government by an amendment of the Registration of Persons Act. And overall, it was meant to replace the current manual ID system, which has been in existence since colonial times. This NIM system was meant to go even further and link with all manner of government services to be provided. And indeed, there was a lot of lack of clarity in terms of the actual system design of names, beyond public information out there that it was a population register, a national population register. There was no much else. There was no much information other than that available to the public. Simply put, the government was creating the system to solve what it termed as the error-prone, adulterated, in the words of the government, system that has been there since colonial times, and replace it with a new system that the government termed as the single source of truth to solve all identity problems in Kenya. Yeah.
Thank you, Yussuf. I'm going to dig deeper into a lot of what you just covered in a minute. Do you want to turn to Nanjala? Now that we have a little more context about the NIMS and the Huduma Namba, I want to talk more about the rollout and implementation. Nanjala, I know you've criticized the lack of public consultation and debate over Kenya's ID system. So could you share with us your perspective on what went wrong, what you wish had been done differently, perhaps who should have had a seat at the table that didn't, and anything else you may have changed about the process?
I think, well, one part is that as Yussuf said, the rollout of the NIMS of the Huduma Namba system part of the identity card reform. And the Kenyan identity card is rooted in a very dark history of oppression, colonization. It's really one of the Kipande system, which precedes the national ID, the Kitambulisho system, is actually grounded in, it was a pillar of the colonization process. So one thing that I would have loved to see is a critical review of what the data that we're collecting, what it says about who we think a Kenyan is, and what we think makes up the identity of being a Kenyan. So for example, the Kipande Kitambulisho it's a patrilineal system. It makes it difficult for people who have lost their parents or who don't know their father, who, children of single parents, children of people who have been orphaned, things like that, to prove their identity, because they can't necessarily trace their identity back on the father's side of the family. And it doesn't necessarily look at women, even though women are the majority of the country's population. There was no consultation on how we could make this system a little bit less patrilineal and a little bit more inclusive in this direction. The whole rollout process, even though the government had been having internal conversations about this for a long time, in public, we were given 30 days to register for this new system, and it was under a cloud of threats. It was either you get the new system or you lose access to death registrations, birth registrations, marriage registrations, no passport renewals, no driver's license renewals. No, it was basically you would, if you didn't get this card, you would cease to exist as a citizen in the country, which is obviously, that's not how you do policy rollout. That's not how you get people engaged in a process of policy rollout. The card itself doesn't go far enough to address the root causes of inequality that hinge on identity that are very prevalent in the country. One of the things that was embedded again in the Kipande system that was not reformed with the Kitambulisho system, that has not been reformed with the name system, is this idea of vetting. That we wanted people from specific ethnic groups because we suspect them to be second tier citizens, second or third tier citizens, that they have to go one step further, 2 steps further to prove their identity. And vetting is actually a stumbling block that is deliberately put in place in order to reduce access to services for people from specific ethnic groups. The case that Yussuf oversaw, we talked about the Nubian community in Kenya, which has been systematically denied access to ID systems. This new NIM system was silent on all of these systematic exclusions. So I would have liked to see a public consultation on some of these embedded structural inequalities that, as Kenyans, people are very well aware of and have studied and have discussed and have analyzed. So we know the problem. It would have been nice to be included in the process of debating the future of identity systems in the country so that we can address the problems and we can stop compounding them and stop compounding the harm.
Thank you, Nanjala. Yussuf, I want to give you an opportunity to respond or react if you'd like.
Yes, I do agree with everything that Nanjala said. I mean, just to give a context in terms of the threats that were used at the time of registration, there was a statement by the Minister of Interior who said that we will not force you to register, but you will have no option but to register. So which was a very interesting time. I mean, everyone was getting phone calls from their relatives. I mean, the older generation always used to a very fearful and oppressive government. I was the lead counsel on the case. opposing the rollout of the Huduma number. And my parents kept calling me every day to go and register. And that shows you the level of pressure that was being exerted on the ordinary Kenyan. The securitization of it, I mean, NIMS was highly securitized. I mean, the level of, the number of objectives that were put in there with regard to addressing issues such as terrorism, which were being thrown around as reasons why NIMS was being rolled out, made it as opaque as could be, and therefore Kenyans are not being given an opportunity to really understand what was being rolled out and what effect it would have on their rights. And because the system was so wide-reaching in terms of the impact and in terms of the effect it was going to have on the system of governance that we have as a country, essentially this was the creation of a new digital citizen in Kenya that was separate from, you know, the living corporal citizen. And this digital citizen that was being created was not in any way connected to the individual that currently existed, save for the fact that you needed an ID number if you are an adult, or a birth certificate if you are a minor. The amount of information that was being sought was also quite far-reaching. I mean, before we filed the case, the government even had provision for collection of DNA and GPS data, and that was quite interesting and scary. I mean, if that kind of data is available to a government. So the level of consultation was obviously not commensurate to the effect that it would have on the lives of Kenyans, plus the accompanying coercion and threats made the whole public engagement inadequate.
Thank you, Yussuf. I do want to continue on the sort of the process of the rollout and implementation, which I think often gets overlooked or overshadowed by the kind of specifics of a system or, you know, the tweaks of the technology itself. Nanjala, I know that you've done extensive work around some of the linguistic barriers to, you know, effective digital rights advocacy, well, in the African context broadly, but also specifically in relation to digital identity in Kenya. So I was wondering what role language may have played in the debate around the implementation of the names of the Huduma Namba in Kenya, and how those linguistic barriers, you know, how they played out in terms of the rollout and implementation.
You know, I was involved in the behind the scenes advocacy in terms of trying to get people to be made aware of some of these challenges. And one of the things that really leapt out to me was the fact that we didn't even have, you know, Kiswahili is the official language, is a second national language in Kenya. And we didn't even have the words for all of these things that were being talked about, even though, as Yussuf said, it was going to fundamentally create a new digital citizen. It was going to reorganize our relationship with the state. We didn't have a Kiswahili word for privacy. We didn't have a Kiswahili word for digital protection. We didn't have a Kiswahili word for digital rights even, you know, and all of this, so all of this is happening, and we're, you know, under the cloud of threats, under the cloud of oppression, and you know, you might lose your whole ability to function as a citizen. And we're not even able as advocates to express clearly what is on the table, what is at stake. And the government rollout, as Yussuf said, and you know, for many of us, this is one of the things that, as a tangent, is frustrating in light of what's happening with the vaccines that we're talking about right now, the COVID vaccines, because when the Kenyan government wants to get information from people, they will show up at your village in the middle of nowhere at 8 in the morning with a tablet and collect that information for you. But when it comes to providing healthcare and it comes to providing education, you can't find the government. You have to travel to the nearest big town. You can't get your passport here. You have to travel to, you know, 5 hours to go and get a passport, 8 hours to go and get a passport. So this was one of the frustrating things, was that with the Huduma number, because there was such an interest on the side of the government that it's an exertion of power, it's a reminder of sort of the omniscience of the government. They were in people's villages, some of the smallest and the most remote villages in the country, but not able to express to people for whom English is not their primary language, what it was that they were doing, why this information was being collected. The only thing people got was threats, that if you didn't get this thing, you would lose access to, if you didn't get X, you would lose access to Y. If you didn't get the Huduma number, you wouldn't be able to bury your dead. If you didn't get the Huduma number, you wouldn't be able to register births, et cetera, et cetera. And so that lack of language, I think, not only hamstrung the advocacy efforts, the people who were trying to get people to be aware of what the challenge was, but it also it intensified this cloud of uncertainty, and it intensified this cloud of fear, because it's the government making itself known, showing up, as I said, at a very micro scale, not being able to explain what it's doing, but wanting to sort of siphon all of this information, all of this data from citizens under the cloud of threats. I think it was a very strange time. I mean, like, I just remember the feeling of people scrambling and not knowing why. It's like someone yelled fire in a movie theater and everybody started scrambling and nobody knew why they were scrambling. But part of that air of confusion is we couldn't even express fully what it is that was happening and why it was such a big deal.
Thank you, Nanjala. We will link to some of the resources you've created to help with this problem after the tech talk, and you've been doing some really impactful work there. Going back
Can
to
I comment?
Please jump in, Yussuf.
Yes, I think Nanjala has provoked a thought in me. I mean, during the rollout, one of the things that happened is that, just to add on the point of language, the form that was being used was in English, so there was no access to any other language. And at the bottom of the form, there was a small write-up with a line that says, "I hereby consent to have all the data that I've provided to be shared with any other relevant government agencies or others." And then there was a small box at the bottom with a tick, which you would tick. And one of the questions that was interesting during the litigation was, there was only one way to fill that form, and that was to fill tick. Yeah, exactly. And that was in English. So how would a country where the majority of people do not use English as their main medium of communication, how are they going to deal with that issue of consent? So I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
No, it's a really important intervention. I mean, again, on this theme of identity and power, right? A lot of the mechanics, a lot of the tactics you're describing, as Nanjala said, are kind of a clear display of power and power asymmetries. Do either of you know, why, for example, things were only available in English, or why some of these decisions were made?
I mean, I think part of it is that digital ID systems are being rolled out in poor countries as part of a broader international effort that isn't necessarily an organic grassroots interest, but actually reflects top-down decisions that are being taken at a multilateral level. The World Bank ID4D project has made this a cornerstone, and we're talking about Kenya and as an example, but this has been a problem in Afghanistan, for example, where a lot of money was spent in a digital ID system, and now the Taliban has control of all of this information from all of these people. So Kenya is one of the ID4D countries that the World Bank has identified to roll out some of these projects. Our ID system is built, a lot of the architecture and a lot of the thinking behind it borrows heavily from the India Aadhaar system. So it's this thing that the English is a reflection of, if you think about it sort of philosophically, it's a reflection of the fact that this idea is not an organic bubbling up of interest from the people, but is actually something that's coming from outside and is coming from the top down. We have all of these consultations that are happening at the multilateral level, and I've been in the room for some of them. And we sit there as African citizens and we ask these multilateral organizations, did you ask us what we wanted our ID systems to look like? Did you ask us what kind of information we wanted to be collected? Did you ask us what the politics was of the Kitambulisho so that we could tell you that it's not a good idea to build a Huduma number, to digitize the politics of the Kitambulisho, which is rooted in oppression and is rooted in exclusion and is rooted in inequality? And so for me, the English is really symbolic of this whole broader dynamic of this is not an organic impetus that's coming from the Kenyan people. There is a discourse that's emerging around digital identity systems that is supposed to turn individuals into consumers, primarily into international consumers, into data points that can be monetized, that can be turned into, the Kenyan government said this, Yussuf will remember this, in court, data is the new oil. That was literally the impetus that the CS for ICT gave in the courts to say, this is why we're doing this, because we want to monetize your data points. So I think that there's, if you look at it from a social science, from a philosophy perspective, the language really is an indicator of this broader dynamic. There's something, we're not the ones who are building this for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will turn to the global scale in a minute and zoom out. Just a couple more questions on Kenya's ID system in particular. Yussuf, I know you've brought some successful legal challenges and actually managed to delay and rectify some of the situation. Could you perhaps talk about one or two of those, for example, in relation to the data protection or privacy concerns you raised, and sort of what the status is of some of those legal sort of requirements in terms of sufficiency of the system? We may have lost Yussuf there. Okay, we can turn back to Yussuf. Yussuf, feel free to jump in if you can hear us, or if you're still there. Otherwise, we can go ahead and zoom out to the global scale. Nanjala, I'd actually love to go back to you. I read a very provocative article you authored, I think it was back in May this year, where you said, the question of digital identity systems is now laced with transnational urgency, right? And you talked about, you gave the example of these digital proof of vaccination tools or vaccine passports. And then you authored another brilliant piece on vaccine nationalism and inequality. So, I'd love to hear your view on what impact the pandemic is having on the use of digital identity tools and technologies, and what the risks and implications are, perhaps for both local populations, but also globally.
Sure. And I want to begin my answer by emphasizing that I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea of keeping track of vaccination status. We have vaccine cards for measles, we have vaccine cards for polio, we have vaccine cards even for, in relation to travel, for yellow fever. I had to get a yellow fever certificate in order to travel. So it's not the principle of keeping track of vaccines that's the problem. Once again, for me, it goes back to why we're building these systems, what it is that we're not doing as we're trying to do these systems, who has the power to determine the information that's being collected and what the information will be used for. Are we when you get a yellow fever vaccination certificate or whatever, the document is, the validity of the document is tied to the batch of the vaccine. So when they're looking up whether the vaccine was administered, they're not trying to verify you as your identity, they're trying to verify, was this vaccine actually administered in the place where this person says this vaccine was administered? That's one piece. But the other piece is that yellow fever vaccine, anybody who wants a yellow fever vaccine, the barriers to access are so low that you can get it just about on any street corner, anywhere else, any clinic, any country in the world, if you want it, if it's something that you're interested in getting. It's not something that is loaded with all of these politics of inequality, of locking people out. Right now, only 3% of people in the developing world have been vaccinated for COVID-19. It's not because there isn't enough vaccines for people to get them. It's because there's a deliberate policy choice by rich countries, by rich Western countries, to lock most of the world out from accessing technologies of vaccination and accessing even the actual vaccines. We're having to wait for handouts for vaccines. If you load all of these underlying inequalities onto a digital ID, a digital COVID vaccination system, what we're saying is that the governments are going to become more efficient at locking people from poor countries out. We're going to enmesh this system of some of worthiness that's already a discourse that's embedded in the global migration system, digitalize it and embed it. And we all know, if you look through history, these systems are much easier to build than they are to destroy. It's much easier to lock in this logic of Africans as having, even though the UK, for example, manufactures AstraZeneca vaccine, donates that vaccine to Kenya, then saying the Kenyan vaccine system cannot be trusted, right? Loading the logic that makes that kind of public rationale policy, locking it in and loading it onto a digital process. How many years will it take to undo that kind of thinking? I spend a lot of time thinking about why governments do what they do, not necessarily what it is that they're doing. And I think the big issue that we have in policy work today is that everybody's so focused on the what and nobody's asking the why. Why is it that the UK government would feel empowered to make this this argument in public? And that's a question of inequality. It's a normative question of who does the UK government think is worthy of entering the United Kingdom? Who does the UK government, which people does the UK government think are honest? Why this assumption that African systems are broken, even though, for example, we know that the US system is broken. We know that Americans have been forging vaccination cards, but nobody is saying, well, we're not going to allow Americans to come into the country. So if you look at the why is it that governments want to build digital vaccine certification, travel, whatever? It's not just about verifying whether people have been vaccinated or not. And especially if you layer on this issue of inequality of access to vaccines, what we're standing at the precipice of this thing of just like locking this idea in that some countries, they're going to lie about their vaccine status. They're not worthy to enter this dual system of migration. And that has a knock-on effect. Whenever I make this argument, one of the things that people say to me is, well, we just won't go. We'll be on holiday. We'll go on holiday somewhere else. And I'm like, most people who travel are not going on holiday. The vast majority of people who travel in the world are not going on holiday. We're talking about business people. We're talking about students. We're talking about even people who are migrating. We're talking about refugees. We're talking about people for whom travel is much more embedded in survival, in navigating their reality. So if we locking ourselves into this unequal system, what we're moving towards a system where people will be locked out from those opportunities. We're talking about traders who won't be able to go and get, whatever they need for their businesses. We're talking about students who will be locked out of universities. And so it's much bigger than just, going on holiday and not being able to go on holiday. Tourists are the smallest percentage of people who are traveling in most of the world. And, I say all this to say that I think that the why we need a global digital ID passport has not been interrogated completely. I think that the why is being fueled by a pre-existing logic of unworthiness and a dual system in which Black and brown, it's racist, Black and brown people all around the world are inferior, are not worthy for admission. And once again, you add on the factor of inequality of access to vaccines, we're looking at creating a system that's going to normalize that level of exclusion, that's going to normalize that idea that, none of these countries will ever be able to build systems that we can trust, that we can verify, unless we build them for them. And then we come back in this loop where we're talking about the logic is coming from outside. Then we need to send a British consultancy firm to build the Kenyan digital ID verification system so we can trust it. We need a French firm to build a Haitian system so that we can trust it. That's the kind of logic that it engenders. And I just want people to, we don't have these things, not everything has to be digitized in order to be trustworthy. The yellow fever vaccination certificate has never been digitized. People still trust yellow fever certificates. Measles vaccinations, typhoid vaccinations, every time people get vaccinations, never been digitized, still been trustworthy, because the problem is not digital. The issue with vaccine hesitancy, the issue with people lying about vaccines, it's not about tech. It's about power. It's about the relationship that citizens have with their government. It's about trust. If you take away the reason for people to lie about their vaccines, that everybody who wants access to a vaccine can get it without a challenge, you won't need all of this other system. If anybody who wants the vaccine can walk to their clinic and get the shot without having to go to the WTO and beg for vaccines, you won't need all these other systems, because you won't have that scarcity challenge that you're trying to navigate in this way. So yeah, I just want people to take a second and think about what it is that they're building, and think about what it is, the logics that they are normalizing and accepting as fact.
Thank you, Nanjala. Very powerfully said, and a lot of food for thought. And it's a perfect segue back to Yussuf, if we have you. Yussuf, are you there now? I'll sort of combine the question I was going to ask. Great. So in this sort of, Nanjala is bringing up a lot of really powerful things here around, the why behind these systems, and there's a little feedback there. I don't know if it's, and for example, the unintended consequences of, registries. I know you're doing a lot of work right now on behalf of victims of the so-called double registration problem. And the way I understand is that these fingerprints and biometrics were part of a UNHCR refugee database, but perhaps people weren't necessarily refugees. The system sounds like it was also stood up relatively quickly, top down from the outside in, right, without a lot of sort of foresight or really consideration of the potential impacts down the line. So could you perhaps just explain to us what this double registration problem is, how it's impacting people's fundamental rights, going well beyond privacy, right? Things like the right to work and attend school, freedom of movement, and touch on some of the human rights implications there, please.
I think double registration presents, I don't know if you can hear me. Double registration was the fast, efficient, digitized identification platform that was set up in Kenya, and it was set up by the UNHCR with the objective of, fighting fraud, in access to relief food and healthcare for refugees. And it's quite interesting that people who are dying of, of hunger and thirst in a remote part of Kenya are being forced to give away their biometrics in order to access these things. The effect of this was that as a result of drought in the 1990s, people who lived in northern Kenya were dying of hunger, saw the support that these refugees were getting from the UNHCR and went to the refugee camps. And in order to access these food and healthcare, they were asked to give away their biometrics as a precondition. And what happened subsequently was that these individuals were put in the refugee database, which database was subsequently handed over without their consent to the Kenyan government, which used that information to deprive them of their nationality. These individuals, most of whom were minors at the time, have since then not been able to acquire a national identity card, not being able to move around, not being able to access higher education. They're essentially in prison within the borders of northern Kenya and can't leave. And Haki and Sheria has been working with these people, trying to advocate for these individuals to acquire these nationality documents. And one of the things that was mentioned was that in Kenya, we are very ethnic in terms of the way we approach issues of identity. And the Kenyan Somali community is one of the most excluded communities and the most distrusted communities for historical reasons. And therefore the Kenyan government does not like to address issues involving this community with objectivity, and is prone to exclude this community and to marginalize them. There's been a history of violations, human rights violations in this region. And it is within that context that these individuals have found themselves and are unable to get out of this cycle whereby they are not refugees because they are Kenyans by birth, and they are not recognized as Kenyans by the Kenyan government. By law, they're Kenyans, but because of this administrative process that was conducted by the UNHCR, is now being used by the Kenyan government to keep these people in that state of hopelessness.
Sorry.
Please, I was going to turn to values, but please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because again, Yussuf is touching on what I was saying about the why. the why does the government treat Somali people as second-class citizens? Of course, that's a historical question, and that all goes back to the colonial era, and it goes back to this idea of the Northern Frontier District as being a separate entity from, you know, the main hinterland of Kenya. It goes back to this history of, and this idea of scarcity, and this false idea of scarcity. And I've always struggled because I think they tell us that we're living in the most what is it? We have the most of any generation in history, that we're the most advanced, we have the most stuff basically of any generation in history. And yet this scarcity mentality has become embedded in the way people are doing government and in the way people are doing governance. And so the idea of rationing access to services and rationing access to raw materials and rationing, that was embedded in the logic of the UNHCR system, the idea that there wasn't enough to provide both for quote unquote real refugees and the host communities that they were living amongst. And so that there had to be this registration system in order to make sure that only good refugees were able to access resources. Now you have to wonder, in a context in which again, we're being told that this is the age of plenty and that there's poverty, even in aggregate terms, has gone down, et cetera, what is it that makes it impossible to provide basic services in a way that includes both the host community and the refugee population? What is it that necessitates this differentiation? The idea of Somali people, especially, but also Maasai communities and Borana communities and some communities in Western Kenya are foreigners who are trying to steal from the government of Kenya, is actually embedded in the logic of the ID system in Kenya. If you go all the way back, which we have a paper that's working through peer review right now on this issue, if you go all the way back to 1915 with the first parliamentary records in Kenya, where they're debating the Kipande system, this is one of the thinking that establishes the logic of vetting. You see parliamentarians saying, we want real Kenyans to have access to resources. We don't want, you know, people to take this as stuff that is for real Kenyans. And I think you have to, you know, again, unpack. If we want to build societies that look fundamentally different from the societies that have gone before, we have to be able to sit in the discomfort of some of these why questions and what it is that they provoke us to do. Ultimately, the Kenyan government system did not break away completely from the colonial logic of oppression and exclusion. The idea of ethnicity, the construction, the political construction of ethnicity in Kenya it does not reflect the lived reality of most Kenyans. The fact that on a day-to-day basis, most Kenyans will move fluidly between different aspects of the identity, but here comes the ID system telling us that you can only be one thing, and that thing is something that is determined by your father, and not even by your mother, and not even by any other ways of thinking about relation. All of these ideas, again, are about a certain vision of what government is for, and who is entitled to access government in full. And I think, to loop back to the question that you asked right at the top, Elizabeth, what kind of consultation would I have liked to see? I would have liked to see conversations with Kenyans who have been thinking critically about these issues, and to see submissions from, because people have been asking this question, why is it that ethnicity became so embedded in the logic of statehood in Kenya in a way that isn't really reflected in many other countries, many other colonial, post-colonial societies? And that, of course, is a question about incomplete decolonization and who the government of Kenya thinks it acts in service of, and which people think that they are entitled to run the tools of government, as opposed to who are unworthy to have access to even the basic services, education, healthcare, basic nutrition from their governments.
Thanks, Nanjala. I didn't mean to interrupt earlier. I just wanted to pick up on this question about values, because what I've heard you both note so far are things like speed, efficiency, scarcity, combating fraud, certainty, categorization, patriarchy. I don't know if that's a complete list, but it's definitely an illustrative list. And Nanjala, you recently wrote that a digital identity system cannot create values that don't already exist in the society in which it is built and deployed. And you're speaking quite powerfully to that. Yussuf, I'd also love to give you an opportunity to jump in terms of what values you see driving digital identity schemes, including Kenya's, and what values perhaps you think should be driving them.
Well, I think just to go back on the why, and I like the way that it's been framed, and that sort of gives a very good context of the values. Governments like shiny new objects, shiny new projects. And if this shiny new project is massive and opaque, even better. So, and this is true for all governments around the world. So NIMS was perfect for any government that seeks to point at something that can be used for campaign purposes without without really being held accountable. So the values that underpin NIMS included values such as the best this system would provide, at least what the government said. I mean, the reality, it's a whole different thing. The government said this system would solve all problems, and you need to take that into account. With what I said about shiny new object. This NIMS would deal with security problems. NIMS would deal with health issues. NIMS would be used for elections, and our elections would suddenly become, the most efficient. NIMS would deal with the perennial issues of, yes. But the reality of it was that NIMS was
we may have a connection issue, Yussuf. You there?
I don't know whether you can hear me. Yeah.
No.
The reality of it that was NIMS was, was based on threats, was based on exclusion, was based on, opaqueness, that nobody knew what the system was. And NIMS was meant to foster and increase the lack of accountability of the Kenyan government with regard to its ID system. The current ID system serves only one purpose in Kenya. It serves to exclude, and it serves security agencies in order to do this. So the current ID system serves that purpose. And the new system would serve the same purpose once it's finally rolled out. At the moment, and this is what really shows that NIMS was a shiny new project. The moment COVID came on the scene, NIMS has just petered out, and the resources that were previously up for NIMS was very quickly transitioned to this even more opaque pandemic known as COVID-19 or Corona, and the government could scare everyone, to use American terms, shitless, and therefore that's exactly what it was.
I see Nanjala, it looks like you want to jump in here. Feel free.
Yeah, no, just to agree. I mean, I think that the government's, let me say, I spoke about the government of Kenya, and this particular administration is very much rooted in the idea of big shiny objects, distractions from very simple failures of government, and has a pattern of poor execution, has a pattern of not thinking through anything that they launch, and ending up with half-baked, half-finished projects, roads that have no drainage, expansion of airports that they forget to build key access points. There's a pattern of wanting to do things, and to add to the things that Yussuf said, it's not just new big shiny objects, but new big shiny objects that can be paid for by someone else. As long as there is foreign funding to pay for the project, you can pitch this administration anything and they'll build it. And so this is the challenge that the citizen then finds themselves in, because number one is this government, the whole idea, the whole rationale of government is that it's working on behalf of the interests of the citizen. But where you have this break whereby the government sees itself as beholden to donors and beholden to people that it borrows from, and not to the people that it claims to speak for and claims to represent, how are citizens able to demand accountability? How are we able to shape the systems that we're going to be living under if the government sees itself as being more responsive to outsiders than it is to the people that it claims to govern on behalf of? The government being more solicitous to foreign funders and multilateral institutions, and then turning around to threaten its people in order to build compliance. But then to go back to the question of values, I've said this multiple times and I'll say it again. Digital is an intensifier. Whatever patterns, whatever practices, whatever beliefs it finds within the society that it is embedded, it will only intensify those. If the impetus to exclude was already present in the way governance was being done in that country, it's only going to be intensified. We've seen this in Assam, in India. The impetus to exclude Muslim populations in Assam, in India, was already present. What the digital has done is it has accelerated and it has intensified that process of, to the point where we had almost over 1 million people being made stateless by a single bureaucratic sweep. The same impetus to lock out refugees, to say that certain people are good and worthy people who can access refugee services, and certain people are not good and worthy refugee systems, that made the UNHCR digital ID, registration system possible, being intensified, right, with this double registration system of locking people into the system permanently. This is the kind of thing that we are scared of, because as Yussuf said, when we look at the pattern of practice of government, what has the Kenyan government done in the past? What has this particular administration done in the past? What is the ID card represent in social political organization in Kenya, right? Why do certain people from certain communities get their ID cards within a 4-day window, and some people have to wait 4 years, 30 years, 40 years? Why are some people 3 generations of living, not just living in the country, but living in the capital city, unable to get ID cards, right? And some people who have never set foot in the capital city get them within a 2-3 day window. That has nothing to do with efficiency. That has nothing to do with, the goodness or the badness of the system. That has everything to do with intent. That has everything to do with, as you put it, values. What does the government want its ID system to do? And so I guess for me, I would want people who are building these systems, who are thinking through these systems, and who are thinking in generally about technology and society, to take a second to think about, and well, more than a second, to think about values and to think about these intangible ideas that lie behind the policy choices that governments make. They're telling us that it's about efficient. Well, I have to put the question, more efficient at what? If it's to make governments more efficient at what it is that they're already doing, then we also have to ask ourselves, what is it that the government is already doing? In Kenya, that means the exclusion of the Somali population, which is one of the easily in the top 10 largest ethnic groups in the country. The exclusion of Nubian Kenyans, who are also a significant community in the capital city. The exclusion of multiple ethnic groups, border communities, who are told that they have to endure extra scrutiny in order to prove their citizenship, even if they have other documents that will prove, birth certificates that should actually be equal to the task of proving their citizenship. The securitization of identity, as Yussuf talked about, the fact that you cannot, as an adult, enter a building, and nowadays it's not even just government building, you can't enter a building without producing this little piece of card that says where your grandfather was born and where your grandfather once lived. All of those things are part of the discourse. We cannot just stop at, let's build the most technically efficient system without asking what values does that system propose to make more efficient? What values are loaded in that system that will be made more intense by the deployment of that system?
Thank you, Nanjala. I did promise to take some questions. It looks like we actually haven't gotten that many questions. I think everyone's probably still processing the conversation, but since we only have about 5 minutes left, I thought I'd wrap up with a question about looking ahead in the future and potentially some lessons learned. So, Yussuf, obviously you've had some success through the legal system, through the law and the judicial system, and holding the government accountable, at least in part. But I'm curious whether you are how you feel about the future of the role of digital identity. And whether you're, sort of optimistic about the potential to change some of the values that we're talking about and perhaps instill a different set of values. And Nanjala, the same question for you.
Well, I think we cannot oppose development, and this is one of the key questions that we had to grapple with during the litigation around names. It would be
foolhardy to say that we are opposed to, for example, the building of a certain bridge in a certain location. And same way with NIMS. It's a digital infrastructure project. The digital ID is a project. However, if it can be done in a manner that takes into account human rights, inclusion of people, it takes into account the context that exists, then we would not be opposed to NIMS. And this is one of the things that the court ruled on. It said that there must be regulations that govern systems like this, that curtail what governments can do. And without these restraints, the government will run amok. It will continue to design systems that provide for opportunities for surveillance, opportunities to keep excluding the most disenfranchised and most, weakest of communities, because that's how power works. Power always seeks to exclude the weakest. And it requires a widespread consultation and understanding. Public participation is one of the principles of our constitution and one of the values that we have in our constitution. This must be meaningful, and there must be situations whereby even those who are in the farthest parts of Garissa and other areas who do not have access to the internet are confident that they will still access government services regardless of the rollout of a digital ID system, that their interests are still being taken into account, and that this rollout will be gradual and will ensure that everyone is on board. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Nanjala, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, again, building on what Yussuf has said, around the same time that there was the rollout of the Huduma number, there was also the rollout of the digital passports. So we had to switch our passports over to the digital system, and you didn't have any pushback, significant pushback about the digital passports. Why is that? Number one, because the digital passports, the information that was being collected on the passports is restricted by law, was restricted also in form. But the passport doesn't try to constrain you about to who the government thinks that you are. It doesn't collect ethnic identity information. It doesn't collect GPS information. It doesn't collect any of this extra information, and there are restrictions on who that passport information can be shared with. It's an example of the fact that people are not opposed in principle. We're not opposed in principle to the idea of building a digital system. We're opposed to the idea of giving the government sweeping powers to collect, to sort, to constrain people's identity, to define who the citizens are. And as I said, to continue this practice of exclusion and to continue this practice of marginalization that is already embedded in the ID system in Kenya. So what we want is more reflection, and looking to the future, I think that's what I would love to see more of, is to see more people engaging with the philosophical dimensions of what it is to build a digital ID system, what it is to make a government more efficient, what it is to make a government more present and more omniscient in citizens' life, without there being a corresponding transfer of power in the other direction. Ultimately, governance is about a balance of power between citizens and using citizens in the broader sense of the word, not necessarily constraining to people who belong to a specific political entity, but it's about individuals who have civic and political rights. And it's about balancing those civic political rights obligations with the power that the government has over those people. You don't want to build a system that will transfer so much power into the government's hands that it curtails people's freedom and their ability to live their lives to the fullness that they would aspire to. So for me, looking to the future is to see much more engagement with the normative aspects of what it is to build technology and what it is to deploy technology in societies, especially in societies where inequality and injustice is already pre-coded into the way those societies function.
Nanjala and Yussuf, thank you so much for joining us today. I knew this would be a powerful combination, but still blown away by the insights. We'll obviously continue the conversation with both of you. And for those tuning in, please be sure to join us again on October 11th. We'll be hosting Abeba Burhani, continue to talk about technology and power, and you can register through ThinkND. We look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you so much.